Hey, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. This is a video that's a little bit different. This is going to be a legacy deck tech for Maverick. Something that I wanted to put together for players who are wanting to play Maverick for Eternal Weekend, maybe for the first time, or coming back to the deck after having a big break from it, just to kind of regain the idea of what Maverick is about, how you could be playing it in Legacy, and where it's currently positioned. I believe last week, Eternal Weekend was announced on Magic the Gathering Online, which is really cool because a player like me in Australia can actually play this event, which otherwise I'd have to, of course, travel the world for. So this is going to be really awesome. One really nice thing about Eternal Weekend Online is that if you sign up, I believe it's $25 for entry, you do get access to an account with all the cards on it. So you don't have to pay entry and then also get all the cards somehow and pay for those. You get a God account, which is pretty great. And I think it's a great reason why a lot of players this weekend will be trying out Legacy, who might not have that much experience, or really know too much about the decks that are actually playable, well positioned, and what their options are. So for those of you wanting to play Maverick, I wanted to do a video just to give you a bit of an idea about what it is, and yeah, obviously a deck that I love. I have a site called the greensunzenith.com. Where each month I put out a Maverick monthly going over each archetype of Maverick, because it does have a few different builds. You can play different sort of colors in it, which is nice. It's usually a green-white deck. You do have red splashes for what you might have heard called Punishing Maverick, which runs cards like Pyroblast or Red Elemental Blast, and traditionally runs the Punishing Fire, Grover the Burnwallers combo. You have green-white black Maverick, which arguably right now is probably the best positioned. You get access to a lot of removal, things like Abrupt Decay, Plague Engineer, Kaya, Orzhov Usurper, and also Thoughtseize, which is pretty nice. You then have blue splashes for things like Oko, Uro if you really want it. Meddling Mage is a pretty great card against some of Maverick's sort of worst matchups, things like Doomsday, Show and Tell based decks. You have 4-color decks that play sort of Leovold, Clothis, of course another great card for Punishing Maverick. But yeah, so I think what I'm just trying to say is that with a deck like Maverick, it is of course one deck, but there's a whole bunch of opportunity for players who like all types of different gameplay to actually find the deck that they like, kind of within the Maverick archetype. So what I have for you today is a green, white, black Maverick list. Maverick, in essence, plays around with a card called Green Sun Zenith, which allows you to play a bunch of silver bullets in the deck. This is obviously a creature-based deck, something that you don't really see too much in Legacy. There's obviously a lot of powerful instants and sorceries, and blue is a pretty appealing color in Legacy. So if you're not playing blue, you definitely want to have a deck that can disrupt them. Maybe play a game plan that actually can slow down a lot of blue decks. If you're not playing Brainstorm, you want to be playing a deck that can at least punish the decks playing Brainstorm. So Green Sun Zenith as a card is really nice. It allows you to play one of silver bullets in the deck, but virtually have 5 copies of them thanks to Green Sun Zenith. Maverick has a few advantages over other decks as well in Legacy. You do get access to mana accelerants, so things like Noble Hierarch, Birds of Paradise, also Dried Arbor, which you can, Green Suns for on turn 1 to accelerate maybe another Reliquary out on turn 2. You don't want to be playing too fair. This deck does, of course, win by combat damage or sometimes concession. Things like having a Thalia in play, or maybe locking your opponent out with Collector Oof, or something like a Remnant Excavator and a Wasteland lock. So there's a few ways to win outside of combat damage, but that's going to be 99% of the time how you're going to get there. So to make sure you're kind of in the game when it comes to Legacy in an unfair format, you want to have cards like Thalia, a creature that punishes non-creature decks. Obviously with things like Wasteland in the deck as well, you can really make sure that they stumble on mana, make it harder to cast their spells, kind of keep yourself in the game so that you can create a clock and enough disruption, kind of a good mix of both to win the game. Wasteland and another Reliquary are also a huge appeal. Night allows you to find cards like Caracas, obviously Wasteland, Horizon Canopy if you want to start drawing some cards. It's kind of the Green Sun Zenith for lands within this deck. It's also probably your greatest way to win, because it can become pretty huge. When you're looking at the one-ofs that we have as silver bullets for Green Sun Zenith, we have Collector Oof, which is great against some of the LED decks in the format. Things like Tess, the Epic Storm, Ant, which is another Storm deck called... I'm totally forgetting it. Ant is Tendrils. And then we have things like Mono Blue Prism, which play Emery, some sort of Karn package. So yeah, Collector Oof, of course, also good against the Karn decks, any sort of Chrome Mox deck as well. Collector Oof is a pretty new printing, of course, and is kind of a new coming to Maverick. Traditionally, Gaddock Teeg, which is now in the board for most decks, used to be kind of your combo hate in game one, because your opponent couldn't cast things like Past in Flames or, Time Spiral. That might be wrong. High Tide. I'm trying to think of the card within High Tide, but anyway, Gaddock Teeg, of course, not that great now with so many powerful spells becoming 3 CMC or less. There's more hate in targeted removal. Things like Dead of Winter, of course, as a sweeper is really nice. So Teeg, not as effective as usual, whereas Collector Oof kind of hates on the same matches. Can turn off things like Aether Vials and Mox Diamonds and Astrolabes, so it has a little bit more of a shotgun effect across multiple decks, rather than the bullet of Teeg, where it's great against some combo decks, but against others, it's kind of dirtily. Against a deck like, let's say, Death and Taxes, Gaddock Teeg isn't doing too much. It's kind of a vanilla 2/2 that can be hit by their crackers. Collector Oof, however, stops Aether Vial. It really slows down Stoneforge Mystic getting equipment, so it has some play there. But then in a game one against something like Elves, Collector Oof in this case is going to be the 2/2 vanilla creature, whereas at least Gaddock Teeg stops opposing Green Sun Zenith, and also things like Natural Order. So with Maverick, there are kind of hits and misses. You don't have the luxury of Brainstorm or Ponder, so if you do draw into something like Collector Oof against Elves, it's just bad luck. But again, you do just have those powerful effects in the deck, so that, in the off chance you are playing against something like Tess, you do have the ability to play a turn 2 Collector Oof in game 1, which can be really powerful and in some cases just win the game on the spot. Scavenging Ooze, obviously a great green creature, one of my favorite targets. Great as just a value creature, not only against obviously decks like Dredge, maybe a slow Reanimator start, things like Snapcaster Mage, which aren't seeing too much play in Legacy these days, but it's still nice to have in game 1 against some of the Uro decks, Punishing Fire decks, Life in the Loam decks. There's a lot of utility of Scavenging Ooze, and even when it's not the greatest at disrupting your opponent, it can be a really fast clock. Again, if it's getting to something like a 4/4, bigger than a Lightning Bolt, that can be a massive issue for your opponent, which is really nice. One small thing that's really nice about Scavenging Ooze is that it's a creature that gets counters. So in a format where Oko Thief of Crowns is everywhere, it's really nice to have a creature that's going to be bigger than your opposing Elks because of the counters on it. Scrib Ranger is an interesting one. Scrib Ranger hasn't seen as much play recently due to the deck kind of dropping Mother of Runes. So there's not as many creatures that you can gain a pretty big advantage or swing with them. Scrib Ranger, of course, with Flash can be pretty much a big blowout in some cases, especially if your opponent goes to, say, Wasteland your Savannah, which is a forest, so you can return it if you flash in Scrib Ranger. It's great at blocking Delver and buying some time. It, of course, doesn't trade with Delver when it's flipped, but having a fly in the deck is pretty good, because otherwise, outside of removal, we actually have no way to kill creatures in the air, or at least try to buy some time. We do have a Birds of Paradise, which is a small reason why the deck does play a Bird of Paradise, is that you do have that kind of evasiveness. But otherwise, Scrib Ranger is really your only aerial threat. It can come up that the Pro Blue is really good. There are some interesting decks that see play. Obviously, Merfolk isn't the powerhouse it used to be, so that isn't really being seen. But yeah, some players have been moving away from Scrib Ranger as a target because, you can untap a knight, which is great, and use it twice. You can do some things like untap your Noble Hierarch or Birds of Paradise to gain some extra mana. But otherwise, it's a card that I could definitely see being cut from the deck as a silver bullet, and either room for another one or something like a second Scavenging Ooze in the deck. I could definitely see that. Ramming Up's really nice, getting back Wastelands every turn where it's relevant. You can also get things like Horizon Canopy back, or maybe a Caracas if it's relevant, it's gone to the graveyard. Ramming Up's just really nice. It helps you kind of get back in the game after being maybe wastelanded out of the early game by something like Rug Delver or the Mirror. And in game one can be pretty hard to deal with, especially if your opponent has gone for a kind of wasteland you out strategy and you've landed a Ramanap. It really changes the dynamic of game one, and can really bring you back into a position where you can actually play out your land drops for the rest of the game and kind of win from there, which is nice. Knight of Autumn is in the deck. This is favored right now over Qasali Pridemage. Pridemage has the added bonus of it's a 2-drop, which is nice, of course. This deck has a few 3-drops, so being lower in the curve is relevant. Exalted is pretty cool, and it does add up. There are moments where you don't really realize it, but you have a Thalia in play and a few Noble Hierarchs, and you're attacking for 4 or 5 a turn instead of just the normal 2. So Exalted is a pretty big thing. The other reason that Qasali is really nice is that you can use it when you want, so you can actually have some amount of play in your opponent's turn. Knight of Autumn is a sorcery speed effect, of course. You play it on your turn, so you don't have access to something like if your opponent end step puts in a Jide off a Stoneforge Mystic and then untaps and equips it and attacks. You kind of have to wait till your turn to play Knight, destroy the Jide, and you're probably losing some creatures with that, with the counters. But because this deck plays things like Abrupt Decay and the meta shifted a little bit away from Jide and Death and Taxes for now, I think that Knight of Autumn is still a great choice. I think for Eternal Weekend there might be some amount of combo, and Show and Tell is usually a pretty popular deck when it comes to big events, so Knight's really nice because an awkward situation is where your opponent casts Show and Tell, you put in a Qasali Pridemage and they put in Omniscience, and they have priority first, so they can cast something like an Emrakul for free, and then you can blow up the Omniscience. But if you have a Knight, of course, the trigger goes in the stack, you get to destroy the Omniscience before they get to cast the Emrakul, but neither play around the Cunning Wish line, which is pretty rough. But I think Knight of Autumn is just really nice as well because she does have the nickname of Swiss Army Knife, or Swiss Army Knight. There we go, we got there. Because she just has so many abilities that it's actually quite good in different matchups. Maybe for some reason you just want a 4-3. Maybe you want to gain some life against Blue Delver or Burn just to stay in the game for a bit longer. Maybe you do want to destroy a target artifact or enchantment. Knight's really nice in a majority of matchups. There's some like Rug Delver where you might just take her out, but usually she's a pretty nice threat. Questing Beast. Questing Beast is obviously a new card printed in Throne of Eldraine. A card that I think a lot of people didn't realize how good it was and still until they started playing with it. Maverick in general doesn't have traditionally hasn't had too much access to haste creatures. So a really historic matchup was something like let's say Miracles, where they could, you have 3 creatures out, you're beating down, they Terminus end step, you lose all your creatures, they untap, play a Jace, and then you're at the stage where you got to play a creature, it's got to survive a turn, and then you got to attack with it into the Jace to try and get rid of the Jace, or another Planeswalker. But now with Questing Beast in the deck, there's so many ways that you can actually just get back in the game from that situation, thanks to Beast having haste, which is really nice. It can't be blocked by creatures with 2 power or less. This is great against things like Icewind Coatl, Baleful Strix, Monastery Mentor, any sort of Mother of Runes deck. Not many of their creatures outside of maybe Flicker Wisp or an opposing knight have that power of 2 or more, or 3, sorry. Combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented. This is pretty good against protection, of course. So if a True Name Nemesis blocks this, the True Name Nemesis is going to die. If your opponent blocks it with a creature and then gives it protection with Mother of Runes, it's still going to die. If your opponent tries to Maze of Ith this, it's still going to die, unfortunately. Glacial Chasm, another one that doesn't see too much play these days, but something to think about is, these cards don't do anything against Questing Beast, but your opponent might not think this. I've definitely had opponents crop rotation away a pretty vital land for something like Maze of Ith to try to maze a questing beast, but it just doesn't work. Another thing just to take into consideration is attacking your opponent, which I know it says that whenever questing beast deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that players controls. Sometimes you're just in a tunnel effect of, I want to kill their planeswalker, I'm attacking their planeswalker. There's a lot of text in this card, and even I still forget it. So just always take your time, think about the card, think about what you're wanting to achieve, and just make sure that you're kind of using it correctly. One vital thing I'll say about Questing Beast and Thalia that will definitely come up if you play this deck is that if they get elked, they're still legendary creatures. So you can use Karakas to return your own legendary creature, like Thalia or Questing Beast, that was an elk, to your hand, and then replay them as their current status, which is kind of cool. So if your opponent elks or Questing Beast, you might have the ability to return it to your hand, play it, has haste, attack for 4, kill something. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Sylvan Library is probably my favorite card in the deck, as it just really allows that consistency. It allows you to get ahead in card advantage as well, which isn't something that Maverick tends to traditionally have outside of something like maybe Ramanap, Stoneforge Mystics to some extent in those kind of old school builds. But Sylvan Library is just a great play. A lot of decks still don't have great answers to it in game 1, which is nice. So usually if it's resolving, it's probably sticking. I think one thing to note about Sylvan Library and being a player who has Sylvan Library is really understanding how fast your opponent can clock you, and knowing how aggressive you can be with Sylvan Library. Against a deck like Snow, which isn't the greatest matchup, and I'll get to that in a bit, you can most likely use Sylvan Library pretty effectively. They're not a deck that's going to have a great clock straight away, outside of a fast Uro or Oko start. So Sylvan Library is a card that you can take pretty good advantage of against a deck that's trying to be the control player against you. So huge fan of Sylvan Library. Once Upon a Time is an interesting one. Of course, it's free in your opening hand. It can allow you to keep some otherwise shady hands, maybe a 2-lander with a bunch of 3-drops, or a hand where you're wanting to get out of, like, maybe you have a Hierarch, a Plains, and a Wasteland, and then a really nice hand with a Once Upon a Time. You can rely on the ones to find a green source a lot of the time. You do have a fair number of them. But it does allow you to keep some hands that aren't the greatest otherwise, or at least are pretty risky if you don't find X. And it also allows you in the mid to late game, kind of make sure you're not just drawing lands into lands. You can try to dig for something. Maybe you're wanting to dig for Plague Engineer because you can't find the Green Sun Zenith. Maybe you're wanting to dig for Karakas because you don't already have a Knight out. There's a few different roles of wants. But I think it's really good. I know that Achilles27, who's a pretty big Maverick player, he streams at Achilles27 on Twitch, and is in most challenges on the weekends doing pretty well. I know he's a big fan of it. I believe he's running 4 once in 1 Sylvan Library. I'm just a huge fan of seeing Library, that's why I play the 2. But either way, I think once is a pretty cool card. We discussed Knight. It's obviously a pretty great card. It's the main way that this deck wins. You do kind of have 8 copies as well of the Green Sun Zenith. And you do have a number of plains or forests to sack to go and get what you need at the time. So Plague Engineer is of course a pretty huge card. Maverick in general doesn't have the greatest out to go wide strategies like elves or goblins. So Plague Engineer was a pretty huge printing. Before that you might have seen Zell's Persecution, or Engineered Plague in the sideboard of Maverick, but now to have a card that we can probably main deck, and we are, and a lot of Maverick decks are these days, it's been really nice. It can also do things like it can get rid of Icewing Quaddles, which is great because it makes your opponent have to deal with the Plague Engineer before they can maybe flash an Icefang and trade with something like a Knight that you don't really want to happen. So Plague has a lot of game to it. I would say it's turned something like the Elves matchup into not so favored to even if not slightly favored in game one, just because of the amount of removal a green white black Maverick deck now has. It's pretty nice. Three swords and 3 abrupt decay. This is a pretty recent innovation by Achilles, I believe. Kind of just showing that the power of uncounterability of abrupt decay is so huge that it's worth having the 3rd one over the 4th swords. Abrupt decay also a lot more versatile, hitting things like back to basics, blood moon, planeswalkers, equipment. There's a bunch of targets for abrupt decay. Whereas sometimes swords against your your combo or your control kind of low creature count decks can just be stuck in your hand. One thing to note as well is that cards like Dreadhorde Arcanist really need to be answered straight away. So as great as it is to have that 4th swords, having it countered is pretty huge because this deck doesn't have a great one to dig for the next one. So making sure your removal hits and hits hard is a great reason why you should be running 3 decays, because outside of something like Veil of Summer, which you shouldn't have to worry about in game 1, it's going to resolve and you're going to have that kind of little bit of safety, which is nice. Kaya Orzhov Usurper. A planeswalker that I don't think many players think is legacy playable or would have come close, but I think right now, and obviously a few other Maverick players think is pretty well positioned. Kai's +1 is an exile ability. You can target 2 cards from a single graveyard, and you gain 2 life if you exile a creature card this way. You can use it defensively if you want to be using it maybe on your own creatures to actually start getting some life, but usually you're getting rid of your opponent's graveyard to really remove it as a resource. Not just targeting things like Uro, which are around, or removing targets for Dreadhorde Arcanist, but also things like Snapcaster Mage, Delve, future escape spells. It's really nice. Obviously really nice as well if you can snag something like a Life in the Loam or a Punishing Fire, or maybe even a slow reanimated target. But Kai has been really nice. The neg 1, exile target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 1 or less. With converted mana cost 1 or less does seem a little bit narrow, but there are a few targets. I don't know the full list, but I don't think there's many... there's not many decks in Legacy right now that don't have a target, which is pretty good. This is anything from Chrome Mox, Mox Opal, Mox Diamond, Aether Vial, maybe an offline Mother of Runes, Opposing Noble Hierarchs, Delver of Secrets. We're talking Chalice of the Void, Astrolabe, of course, which can be pretty huge. If your opponent fetches for a forest and then you take out their Astrolabe, that's gonna slow them down a fair bit. There are a whole lot more. I just can't name them. Goblin Lackey is a big one, especially on the play. If you can go turn 1 Noble Hierarch, turn 2 Kaya, exile your Goblin Lackey. That's a pretty nice one. But the big reason that I like Kaya and the shift towards this sort of card is that if you are dealing with something like Astrolabe or Mox Diamond or an Opposing Noble Hierarch, the Kaya is only going down to 2, which means you're getting this really nice value of dealing with their card, and now they have to spend a card to probably deal with a Kaya later on. So you are getting that 2-for-1 ability, which Maverick doesn't have too many of. It's another nice reason why we're playing Knight of Autumn, because you get a creature which deals with a permanent in most cases, and then they have to actually deal with it themselves with another card. So being able to 2-for-1 your opponent is obviously very important, especially in a deck like Maverick where you do have to kind of constrict the amount of resources they have access to and really push the limits of what those resources are doing for your opponent. Also, she has an Neg 5, so Kaya deals damage to target player equal to the number of cards that player owns in exile, and you gain that much life. This is actually highly relevant because a lot of Legacy players, as I said before, don't really give Kaya the credit she deserves, and sometimes don't even kind of acknowledge her on the field. So I have had opponents who have attacked me instead of attacking Kaya, and then I've untapped and ultied her and actually just won the game because they had 12 or 14 cards in exile, which is pretty huge. And it's a pretty nice way to kind of just show that sometimes new cards in Legacy can get you small wins because your opponent just doesn't understand them. And I think that's another reason why Questing Beast is just so good, because, you know, you attack with a Questing Beast and some other creatures, like a Thalia, and they block the Thalia with a True Name Nemesis. The Thalia has First Strike, and combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented. So the Thalia is going to First Strike the True Name, kill it, and then they're still going to take the 4 from the Questing Beast. So there's little advantages you can get by playing some of these cards, which obviously isn't the main reason to play them, but it's really nice. To the board, we have Leyline of the Void. Leyline, I think, is probably one of the greatest graveyard hate pieces right now. Typically, Maverick plays around with Surgical, Leyline, sometimes Bojuka Bog, but without Crop Rotation or Elvish Reclaimer, it's a little bit slow. You know, best case on the play, you have turn 1 Noble Hierarch, turn 2 Knight, and then turn 3 you might have access to a Bojuka Bog. But most graveyard decks where you're wanting Bog are probably either comboing off before that or making use of the graveyard to an extent that you have to start dealing with what's on the board more than what's in the graveyard. Leyline is really nice. It doesn't affect our own graveyard, which is great. It can just get wins, which is nice as well. Obviously, if you win game 1 against an opponent like, say, Black-Red Reanimator, they might not know how you board, and if they do bring in Enchantment Hate, or if they bring in some sort of hate for maybe Surgical. So Leyline can get some turn 0 wins, which is great, especially for an event like Eternal Weekend where every single win counts. But it's also nice because Maverick has a pretty good ability to mulligan to a plan. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of players get trapped by, you know, keeping a 7 with Leyline, playing it, and then not really having a way to start pressuring your opponent, or even having a plan in general. You know, you don't want to keep a hand with Leyline, double Wasteland against, you know, a Black-Red opponent who's shown that they're going for basics early on, or something like that. You want to make sure that you have, you know, maybe a turn 1 Hierarch into a turn 2 Knight, which is perfect, or something like a turn 2 Thalia, you know, that you can cast off the mana that you have in hand. So it's not always about the Leyline, but if you do want to mulligan for a Leyline, I think Maverick in general mulligans pretty well, especially when you have access in your mulligans to fast mana. It can really help make sure you can start setting up a board presence from the go, and help, you know, not just rely on that Leyline, because a lot of decks like Hogak might have something like Assassin's Trophy, and once that Leyline is gone, these decks have an incredible amount of speed that they can achieve, you know, their goal of either comboing off through their own graveyard or just using it pretty much straight away as a way to win the game. So you can't just rely on Leyline. Again, you know, against something like Test, you can't just rely on Thalia. You do need extra disruption in things like Collector Oof, or fast pressure through something like Knight. So I do like the full 4 Leylines. I believe this gives you like a 39.x percent to have in the opening hand, which is really nice. You could go down to 3. I have seen other players go down to 3, but I just like the full 4. I mean, Leyline is just such a good card in your opening hand. I don't want to do anything to lower the chances of it being in my opening hand. One other thing that's really nice is that Leyline is castable in this deck. We do have 2 Bayous. We do have Birds of Paradise. We do have Script Ranger, so, you know, you can use Bird twice for black mana, which is kind of cool. Felidar Retreat. This is kind of a new card, of course, and a card I've been trying out against decks like Snow, where Snow is just going to grind you out a little bit better, which is a pretty big feel bad because Maverick is a deck that traditionally grinds really well. But in a deck like Snowco, and of course, as I talked about just before, a deck with a lot of 2-for-1s, like Icebank Waddle and Oko, and, you know, Uro, it's hard to keep up. So Felidar Retreat is a nice way to go wide. It does make your creatures bigger than most of theirs. It's, I think, a great way to try to beat Snow, especially in games 2 and 3, where Retreat is a very hard card to deal with once it's on the field. Maybe something like Assassin's Trophy can get it, but otherwise, you know, it can't be blasted, which is great. It can't be attacked like a Gideon or another Planeswalker. I think it's got legs. I'm not sure if this is typically the build that should be playing it. Maybe you should be playing a build with something like Elvish Reclaimer as a Green Sun Zenith target, but for now, this is where I like attacking Snow with and other sort of mid-range decks like the Maverick Mirror. But you might have seen things like Vraskil Golgari Queen or Kaya Ghost Assassin. There's a few Planeswalkers you can play on your board, and they're typically, again, for the same sort of matchups. So you can be bringing them in for those sort of decks, because otherwise, in this sort of sideboard, you don't have too much for these matchups. So Felidar Retreat, I think, is a pretty nice card, but of course, if you have Planeswalkers that you like, bring them in. The fourth Swords to Plowshares and 2 Path to Exile. These are mainly for other creature matchups. The paths are great against, Delver of Secrets. Rug Delver typically is a deck that doesn't run basics, which is great, so it's kind of a better Swords to Plowshares in that instance. Path to Exile is also a great way to attack Marit Lage. Obviously, this deck is winning by combat damage a lot of the time, so giving your opponent 20 life can sometimes be anywhere between 3 to 5 extra turns, which doesn't sound great. So Path is really nice to have against that sort of deck. And in general, it's usually a case of, is this creature that my opponent has a better resource than an extra basic or an extra mana for my opponent for the rest of the game? And a lot of the time it isn't, and that's where Path is just so good. Because even though you're giving your opponent maybe an extra land, you're taking a Tarmogoyf or another Reliquary off the field, and having to make your opponent have to actually set up another creature to win with. So Path is really nice. The breakup as well is also quite nice against something like Espervile, where there's a card like Meddling Mage, which might be naming Swords to Plowshares in games 2 and 3. And you of course have things like Abrupt Decay and now Path to Exile to deal with them as well. Chalice. Chalice of the Void is a card that I think recently has definitely dropped in popularity. With cards like Oko around, it's not as great as it was. Some players might play something like Deafening Silence in this spot as just another way to attack some of the combo matchups, and a way to slow down your opponent and build out enough disruption and pressure so that if your opponent does deal with a Chalice, they can't deal with your onboard presence. But I like Chalice in this list because you can play it for 0 against a lot of decks that you bring it in against, to stop things like LEDs and Lotus Petals. You can also bring it in against a deck like Bug Hogak on the play, because Chalice on 1 is very good for us. It does turn off some of our own cards, but when you're turning off 80% of their deck, it's really nice. So it does have a little bit more play to it than something like Deafening Silence does. Deafening Silence, great against Ant, great against Tess, a lot of the fast combo matchups, but not great against something like Bug Hogak, where you can bring in Chalice. Or maybe even Elves on the play, you might think about Chalice, but obviously Deafening Silence, not a card you want to think about. Thoughtseize as well. So Thoughtseize is a card that probably saw a bit of a downturn when Veil of Summer was printed, and obviously picked up a lot of popularity in the format. But I think the Thoughtseize is just so strong that, if you do get hit by Veil, that's magic and that happens. But if you don't, Thoughtseize is just so nice to really understand how you should be progressing your game, what sort of creatures you should be finding, what sort of creatures you should be playing first up. Should you be going for a Thalia or a Collector Oof first, and then going for some pressure in Knight or Questing Beast to slow your opponent down first. Also the ability to take a card you just can't deal with. Thoughtseize is pretty fantastic because you can have a hand of Swords to Plowshares, and your opponent has maybe Oko, so you want to try to take that because you don't have Abrupt Decay. You might not take Abrupt Decay because they have something like Jace in hand, so you take the Jace because you can't of course enter that. But I think Thoughtseize is just really nice. And again, a card that you can bring in against a lot of matchups. Even some of the Stoneblade lists, I don't mind bringing in some number of Thoughtseize, because you can take things like Equipment. There are some other decks that kind of just always have cards in hand, like Snowco, or even Goblins at times. There are matches where I do feel Thoughtseize would be okay because of the amount of card advantage they get off things like Matron, Ringleader. It's not usually a dead top deck, which is kind of nice. So overall, Maverick is a pretty nice choice. It won the challenge last Sunday week. And over the past couple of months, it's probably put up between 8 and 12 top 8 Legacy Challenge finishes, which is really nice. I don't think it's a straight... It's not a deck that I don't think a lot of people would run to, having a free account for a Legacy Eternal Weekend event. But I think it is a great deck for a pretty unknown field. Because of cards that are versatile like Green Sun Zenith, if you keep a hand with a Green Suns and maybe like Noble Hierarch and like some Swords to Plowshares or Abrupt Decays, and your opponent goes like maybe turn 1 Ponder, you might want to go for Collector Oof ASAP, or you might want to go for Scavenging Ooze against a Graveyard deck if you can see that it's going to be a Graveyard matchup. So Green Sun Zenith gives you a great way to pivot your strategy and make sure that you have game against everything, because you are going to lose to fast combo a fair amount, but that's why we have a fair amount to bring in from the sideboard. But you do have some really nice outs to a lot of the decks in Legacy right now. And a lot of game as well. You can just bully your opponents with 12/12 Knights. So I think that Maverick is a pretty great pickup for any player wanting to play a creature-based deck in Eternal Weekend. Obviously a deck with a lot of game to it. It doesn't really have any terrible matchups outside of maybe Show and Tell or some fast combo decks, but again, we have the board to hopefully slow them down enough to pressure them to a win. That's about it. If not, I hope you guys enjoy Eternal Weekend. I know I will be. I'm going to be streaming the whole event at twitch.tv/DukesOnTwitch. You can, of course, find any other information you want at thegreensunzenith.com. You can check me out on Twitter as well at twitter/DukesOnTwitch. And ask me any questions. If you ever have any questions about Maverick, maybe you have a deck list that you want some opinion on, I'm more than happy to look at it. We have a really good Discord as well. The Maverick community is very open arms, very open to interpretations and opinions on different decks. So I think if you do run this list in Eternal Weekend, definitely come and say hey, because a lot of people would be very cool to hear, or very happy to hear about your experience with the deck. But yeah, that's the deck tech. This should be a pretty fun weekend. I'll see you guys.